But really, the governor's second year of his first term was dominated by national politics, because that was the fight between Barry Goldwater and Nelson Rockefeller for the presidential nomination. And that was the last time that a governor in Michigan got elected for a 2-year term.
Right.
So your father had to run for re-election.
Well, actually, that wasn't the last. He ran in 62 for a 2-year term.
Yeah, yeah.
And then he ran in 64 for a 2-year term.
Yes, yeah.
And then 66 was a 4-year
That's what
term.
I mean. He had
Yes.
to run for the last 2-year term that existed
you got it
under
exactly
the new
right.
Constitution.
You're exactly right.
So when he ran, he had to run with Barry Goldwater at the top of the ticket. And Barry Goldwater wasn't faring very well in the polls.
Well, and my dad viewed Barry Goldwater. He would not endorse him because he was concerned that he was inferring or implying, or whatever you want to say, a racist tone, and he felt that that was inappropriate, and he was very, very concerned about that. So he would not endorse him.
Was he concerned that Barry Goldwater was going to be on the top of the ticket in Michigan when George Romney, was running for re-election as governor right below him and could be affected by the
Well, I think
results?
his principles were more important than anything, because at the Cow Palace out in California, he made it very clear what his view was about Barry Goldwater. He ran as a favorite son, so that the state of Michigan would not initially support Goldwater in the nomination process, and made a major effort toward the planks of the Republican Party to include civil rights and other matters that he thought were important. So it was really more a matter of principle than anything else.
Well, there was a question of survivability.
Well, there was a big.
Could he survive in the face of a LBJ landslide win over Barry Goldwater? And the so-called ticket splitter strategy evolved around this time, and maybe it was already in place in 1962. And Walt DeVries was, I think, his kind of Svengali guru in the executive office, had some ideas on that, wrote a book about it called The Ticket Splitter several years later, co-authored with Lance Terrence. How much was that part of the 64 campaign and the success your father had in that election?
Well, he would, if they didn't have that strategy, and if it weren't successful, he wouldn't have won. I think, I forgot what the total number was, but my mind says it was $1.5 million victory for Johnson.
Well, I think that the net was, it was like $1 million plus for Johnson. Your father won by 500, $500,000. So
yes.
You combine them,
$2 million.
Whatever, it was huge.
Huge.
So, in other words, explain a little bit, what was the ticket splitter strategy? What was it?
Well, the strategy really was to encourage people, at that time, to try and encourage people in the suburbs largely to vote for Romney because of what he would do for the state, and make sure that they understood what value he would bring to the state.
Even if they voted for Democrats,
even if they voted for Democrats
or whatever.
For the federal
and
office.
I think DeVries and others kind of identified who these voters were, and they really targeted them.
They targeted them largely in those days by newspapers. Today you would do it by social media and other means, but that was largely by local newspapers at that time.
So can you remember election night 1964? Were you here? You were going to Michigan State at that point. Do you remember the victory party? Were you apprehensive about, going into the election, whether he'd emerge victorious or not?
I do remember being worried. I do remember my brother and I campaigning, and we went into Detroit and knocked on people's doors. And I remember how positive so many people were about my father in the city of Detroit at the time, and many African Americans. And then I remember there was a major effort to try to slander my father by saying he was not for equal rights and so forth, and several people came out in his defense, including Damon Keith, to make it clear that he was a major proponent of civil rights. So my father's vote of the African American community doubled every time he ran.
Right, right. After he wins re-election in '64, he takes over, but he's got a heavily Democratic legislature. For the first time since before the Second World War, Democrats have been out of power something like 26 years. And do you remember any stories or anything he said, or what was your impression of how he was able to work with Democrats in the legislature?
Well, I don't, Bill. I don't remember that. I do remember going to a budget meeting when I was a student at Michigan State, and I went to the meeting, and they were talking about the budget and everything, and they went through a number of different things, and mental health, and this issue and that issue, and then it came to the vending machines in the Capitol, and at the end of the discussion, Dick Van Dusen said, "You know, we spent more time on the vending machines in the Capitol than we did on some other very important topics."
Okay, so in
But I don't remember the efforts of dealing with it. I do remember that he was able to get some cooperation from a number of people about some of the things that he thought were important, but it was
Right.
not as easy as he would like.
How about 1966? Now, that was the year of the so-called Romney Action Team, where they actually printed up bumper stickers with like Romney Griffin, Bob Griffin running for the U.S. Senate, or Romney and whoever the congressman might be, Vanderjack, Romney Brown, Romney Esch, and they went around the state.
You've got the names.
And it was, you know,
Huge victory.
a huge victory where not only he won at the top of the ticket, but he swept a lot of Republicans down ballot in, and it kind of made up for what had happened 2 years earlier.
There's
Right?
no question it was a significant victory for Republicans, and I think he switched 6 congressional seats in the
Yes.
state in that election. And of course, Bob Griffin won the Senate, and my dad took Bob Griffin with him everywhere. There were pictures of them crossing barbed wire fences to be able to get to some of the events that were labor events and other things. So he really made an effort to help all of the ticket win in that election.
Yeah, your father was famous for almost scaling fences, trying to get into union picnics.
Well,
and
there were
getting a
some
lot
great pictures of
publicity.
him in the paper. There were
Yeah.
on the Labor Day celebrations. There would be the big stand on the dais with all the labor officials, and then over in the corner, all by himself, would be Lonesome George sitting by himself because he came to those events himself because he wanted to support those.
Did you
the
and
people.
Mitt help him a lot in that campaign?
We went to a lot of things. He would go to the factories and shake everybody's hand, and very active. We were involved, but again, knocking on doors and doing other things, but not much more than that.
Now, your father's opponent in that election was Zoltan Ferenczi, who had
Zoltan
been
Ferenczi.
Democratic state chairman. And didn't President Johnson come into Michigan to campaign for Zoltan?
President Johnson came in to campaign for Zoltan Ferenczi, and when he came in and went to an event for him, he mispronounced his name, which the papers all covered, which was pretty hilarious. But when he came in, my dad as the governor, met him at the airport. And so they went out on the tarmac, and President Johnson said, "Come in and sit in my car next to me." So my dad sat in the car next to President Johnson, and John Dingell, the congressman, a big man at the time and healthy, grabbed my dad by the shoulders and pulled him out and said, "You don't sit in there." And and President Johnson said, "Yes, he does." And he went back
He
in.
went back in. Well, of course, Johnson was a pretty big man himself.
Johnson was a good-sized fellow himself.
He could stand up to John Dingell. Well, that's an interesting story, fascinating. So the Romney Action Team wins, and then we get to 1967. This is your father's third term, the first four-year term in Michigan history for a Michigan governor under the new Constitution, which your father championed. And there were all sorts of things that happened in 1967. There was the first state income tax was enacted. The open housing legislation that your father championed was passed. We had the Detroit riots in the summer of '67. We had your father going to Vietnam. We had the interview on TV with Lou Gordon, in which your father claimed that he'd been brainwashed by the generals over there. In the meantime, your father had announced he was interested in running for president. The polls showed him ahead of LBJ at the time he started running. All these things happened in 1967.
Pretty exciting.
Very exciting. What do you remember about any and all of that stuff?
Well, I remember all of those things. Yeah. I remember, particularly, I remember the riots and how difficult a time that was. And I spent the days with my father. As a matter of fact, we stayed overnight in a hospital downtown. We traveled around, and I remember my father kept trying to get the federal troops to come in to help calm the city down, and asked Johnson for the federal troops, and Johnson kept delaying it. He sent Cyrus Vance here, and Cyrus Vance would drive around with my father my father would make the request and put it in writing, and then it would come back. Cyrus Vance and the president wanted it worded slightly different. So my father would word it slightly different, and it would come back several hours later, say, well, that wasn't good enough. You need to say this. And so they kept trying. And I think it was really political. They wanted the nation to see and him to suggest that it was totally out of control, and that and that
they wanted him to swim by himself.
They wanted him to swim by himself. They didn't want it to look like that
they weren't going to bail him out.
He could get it out.
Yeah.
So they weren't going to bail him out.
Yeah.
And so it was and of course there were major other riots at the same time in Watts and several other cities in the United States. It wasn't only in Detroit. Detroit was one of the worst ones.
Newark was another one.
There were several of them across the country. Yeah. But Johnson made a real effort to make it political, in my view.
Right.
And I think subsequent writers have seen that. So I do remember that very well. I also remember his interest in running for president. He felt that he wanted to make a difference and felt that he could do something to help the country, and really believed in that. And so it was interesting because he did go on the Lou Gordon. He took a trip to Vietnam, and he was convinced that the generals were misleading him, and that Westmoreland particularly was misleading him. And it was kind of interesting because when he did say that he'd been misled, and then he said that, and they'd given him a snow job, and then he used the word brainwashing. And of course they made terrible fun of him for using that name, that he's so weak to be brainwashed. But it was interesting because Bob McNamara's family wouldn't talk to my dad after he said that, and he was the Secretary of Defense at the time, had been, of course, Citizens for Michigan co-chair with my dad. Wouldn't talk to him, but then Bob McNamara, 30 years later, said that they weren't telling the truth, that they were misleading everybody, and everybody called him a hero. But at the time, they made fun of my dad for saying what really was true. They lied to us about what was going on in Vietnam. And so he was on the Lou Gordon show.
Yeah.
He said brainwashing. His aide Travis Cross had the opportunity to look at the video afterwards and take anything out that he wanted to. Didn't see anything in it that was troublesome, and so that ended up. And then Lou Gordon went out and good for him. He went out and said to the New York papers 2 or 3 days later, after it had been aired, nobody had paid any attention to it. Say he said this, and then that caught fire. The Republicans across the country and the Democrats made fun of him for saying he was brainwashed.